Do it.
All right, welcome everybody to the Thoughtful Bro. We are not live today. We are recording to post this on a Mighty Blaze. We just couldn't quite get Facebook to cooperate today, but no matter. It's going to be a killer interview nonetheless. And I'm so glad you're all joining us whenever and wherever that may be. As usual, we're recording on Tuesday at 2 p.m. for the Thoughtful Bro. We're here to talk about what makes great authors tick, what makes great stories tick. And if you want to support a Mighty Blaze, which is a collective of authors who are just supporting other authors during COVID, you can just like us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We've had just an amazing run of interviews. It's just in the last few weeks, we've had Erica Jong, Dean Koontz, John Irving, Judy Bloom, Edward Dandikat, Cheryl Strayed. We also had National Book Award winner Sigrid Nunez on, and we have another National Book Award winner today in Phil Klay. More for Phil in a moment. We are also doing something at Blaze called Blaze the Vote. You may have noticed we try to talk about this in any video that we can, any video that we feel like helps to inform the electorate a little bit so that on November 4th, we have a result, which is like the true informed will of the people. That's what we want. So we try to just bring on folks who have something to say about our political landscape. And I think Phil's work, while primarily a work of great literature, I think you'll see has a lot of political aspects to it too. Next week on The Thoughtful Bro, we're gonna have Pete Beattie on. He is going to discuss his all-American debut novel. It's like a fantasy fable romp called Cuyahoga. At The Thoughtful Bro, we love to discuss the soul of America, and that will be another chapter in that great discussion. So tune in for next week for Pete Beattie and his debut novel, Cuyahoga. But this week, I'm going to give it a brief intro, but I mean, I just could not be more excited or honored to have Phil Klay on the show. Phil is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. His short story collection, Redeployment, won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize for Best Debut Work in Any Genre. Redeployment was selected as one of the top 10 books of 2014 by the New York Times. His nonfiction work won the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Journalism, Arts, and Letters in the category of Cultural and Historical Criticism in 2018. His writing has appeared in, just to name a few, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series. His new book, which is his first novel, he's only published 2 books. The first was the collection of short stories, Redeployment. This one is called Missionaries. NPR called Missionaries, quote, an ambitious novel of ideas. The LA Times called it a beautiful, violent, and almost perfect. And the LA Times went on to compare it to Cormac McCarthy and praised, quote, the lurid appeal of Clay's depraved moral universe. So on that cheerful note, welcome, Phil, to the Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you. Yeah, somebody else said it was a deeply ethical book, so you know, only the reader can decide what exactly what's going on inside my head.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, like, to me, I posted this on Twitter this morning, but I sort of thought, I mean, I kind of said it was like, it's if Dostoevsky wrote The Wire and set it in the Colombian conflict, that's sort of what I thought this book was. I mean, it has this kind of, and we're going to get into this in the interview, this kind of like it has a profound moral compass, and there's a lot of deep moral searching, and frankly, a little theological searching coming like underneath the surface, which is like the Dostoevsky piece. Then you have kind of this Colombian conflict presented from several different points of view, and this sort of everybody's just doing their job, and who's right and who's wrong is extremely unclear. So that's the Wire piece of it. But anyway, I don't want to describe it. I want you to have the stage here. Just tell me, why don't you just tell our audience what, in your words, is the book about?
Sure, it's about 21st century war, right? And the ways in which developments in Afghanistan or Iraq can sort of pop up in Colombia and affect the lives and communities in regions there in ways that are totally unanticipated, but also the ways in which things that happen in these small regions and in Colombia can have sort of effects to the other players as well. I wrote my first book about the Iraq conflict. I served in Iraq as a Marine, and I've spent the past 2 decades thinking about war and modern war. And the more that I did that, the more that I thought it was not really possible to just talk about one conflict, because they bleed into each other, where you can have a situation where you've got, say, a Colombian mercenary on an Emirati airbase looking at a Yemeni tribesman through a Chinese-made drone before killing him with an American-supplied missile, you're talking about a globalized network of violence, right? And so the novel follows four characters. Now we meet them in various parts of the world. We meet an American journalist in Afghanistan. We meet a American Special Forces medic in Iraq, and there are two Colombian characters. One we meet in Bogota, in the capital of Colombia. He is a very sort of sophisticated officer, right? Something of an intellectual. He also has a kind of right-wing bent to him, and he's got a daughter who is taking a very different path, and his relationship with her, and essentially whether she's going to repudiate his life, or whether she'll be a sort of the continuation of his life's work is a kind of central tension for him and concern for him. And then there's this kid from a rural region in Norte de Santander on the Venezuelan border named Abel. And the novel is about how this one raid that is based on a real thing that happened, where a Colombian drug dealer ordered a 6-foot-tall teddy bear for his girlfriend, and the Colombian military put a tracker in it and followed it to the birthday party, essentially, so they could kill this guy. The way that sort of restructures the power region in this sort of borderland on the Colombian border, and it brings all these people's lives together in ways that, the novel sort of follows it through and follows the consequences not only within that community, but goes other places as well. We'll put it that way. I don't want to tell readers too much about the ending, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the structure is brilliant, Phil, and I think that it almost feels like, how could you tell a story about contemporary war without this kind of multiple perspective thing that you have? So it's a perfect structure. I would just have to say, I read a lot of books, and the multiple narrator thing is not always justified, but here it is.
It had to be done, right?
Yeah.
Because one thing about Colombia is this really interesting, difficult conflict. There's been this history of struggle. You have these kind of left-wing communist guerrilla groups that emerged out of sort of previous sort of violent political struggles and repression. You had right-wing paramilitary groups fighting them. You have the government. Both of the right-wing paramilitary groups and the guerrillas both get involved in the drug trade, which corrupts not just them, but also sort of all kinds of actors throughout the Colombian system. Then you have the US military presence, right? We've been heavily involved in Colombia for years. And actually, Colombia has been the largest recipient of military aid in the Western Hemisphere since the end of the Clinton administration. You know who one of the people was who helped put that package together? Joe Biden. And so there are ways in which, what happens in Colombia, what gets developed in Colombia, or what gets developed in Iraq doesn't just stay there. And one of the things that the book is concerned with is the American system of targeted killing, right? Kill capture. Now, in what had happened in Colombia with the Americans when we were fighting Pablo Escobar, trying to hunt for Pablo Escobar, is we developed this sort of integrated system where we brought people from different intelligence agencies, worked out processes by which sort of direct action units that are out on the ground, hunting for people, doing raids, intelligence services, sort of signals intelligence, people looking at electronic information, that all these people could be kind of brought together and their actions harmonized in a way to make it more efficient, right? That sort of idea was brought to bear in the Balkans. And then in Iraq, we pumped it on steroids. So under Stanley McChrystal and General Flynn, Joint Special Operations Command, which is Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, the sort of high-speed troops, went from doing 12 raids a month to doing 250 in 2004 to doing 250 in 2006, right? Why the change? It's not because, the Navy SEALs went to the gym and started working out and got more buff, right? And faster on their feet. It's because the system, right, which isn't about a particular unit or a technology or an intelligence service, but rather the way all those things are linked together, that became extremely efficient and sort of brought up to an industrial scale. And when you talk to people, most people kind of think like, Navy SEALs are kind of cool, like doing a raid is kind of cool. We love that in TVs and movies. Presidents like to brag about it. Most people kind of think drone strikes are a little creepy, but if you think about it from the perspective of the targeting system, that's just the flathead and the Phillips head screwdriver at the end of that system. So that system we could help other countries with, and then they do the last part, which is the killing. That's what we did in Colombia. So you have a sort of a tactic that starts in Colombia, gets developed to a crazy level in Iraq, and then comes back in the mid-2000s to Colombia, and we help the Colombian government start killing high-ranking leaders of these communist guerrilla groups in the mid-2000s, right? And so that, I mean, for one hand, is just sort of kind of important for understanding, right?
Yeah.
But how do you talk about that in a way, not just it's going to make it intelligible through narrative to a reader, but how do you talk about it in a way that's going to let them feel what that means, right? Because if you're writing about war, I think you have an obligation, or I think it is most valuable when it's not simply sort of an abstract understanding of the systems, right, that are sort of moving things around. Though that is essential for understanding what is happening and how war is reshaping the world and reshaping, sort of communities. You also need to be able to feel what it's like to be in the shoes of the people in those towns, the people making the decisions, the Colombian military and their interests and the reasons that they might want to work with the US military for one reason, the American perspective, right? And I bring in the perspective of a journalist as well. And so by having sort of people who are parts of different institutions that are a part of this process, I was able, or the plan was that I would be able to sort of show on a visceral level what this looks like, what it feels like, what the cost is, right? After the violence has been done, what the cost is, not just sort of on an individual level, on a spiritual level for the, individual experiencing it, but for communities and institutions that are part of this. And
Yeah,
so
and also, and we'll get into this a little bit later, and also kind of like how important that is to like the U.S. citizens who seem to have very little idea of like how their tax dollars are being used and to what end. So, but before we go on, I mean, I do, as I said earlier, I mean, this is a book about war, but it is really a work of literature. I think there's just some amazing writing in this book. And I just wanted to give a chance for like the viewers to just hear a little bit of that. If you wanted to do a reading or just two sections. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the book.
Buy it. Buy it right now.
There you go.
Wait.
It's got a great cover.
Press pause, go buy, come back. Okay.
They did a great job with the cover. So, so I'll just read. This is the journalist Lisette. It didn't begin with the bombings, by which I mean Kabul was no longer Kabul well before then. There used to be thousands of us Westerners, mostly military and contractors, but also aid workers, missionaries, adventurers, diplomats, and journalists like myself, trying to make our mark or our fortune in the good war, Afghanistan, as opposed to the dumb war, Iraq. The money we brought kept things kicking in our Kabul, the Westerners' Kabul, the city within a city that was unaffordable or just plain off limits to ordinary Afghans. People called it the Kabubble, and the Kabubble meant imported steaks at Boccaccio, bootleg Heinekens on Flower Street, and rooftop parties overlooking the lights that crawl up the sides of the mountains around the city at night. It meant a place you could let your hair down, drink alcohol, and tell strangers the lies you told yourself about why you were there, what you were doing, and what a difference you were making. By 2015, those days were long gone. Troop levels down from a peak of over 100,000 to less than 10,000. And for all the cheerleading for a military exit I've heard from self-righteous European aid workers and 22-year-old journalists seeking to give voice to the Afghan people, I couldn't help noticing that as the American military left, those folks' numbers thinned out too. You didn't see as many correspondents or NGO administrators or even heavily armed white dudes in cargo pants on Street 15 those days. The tide has turned, Obama told us in 2012. Indeed. Then, early morning, early August, the sound of an explosion. So that's the beginning of Lisette.
And that scene just keeps getting better. It's a great scene. Like after the explosion goes off. Yeah.
Thank you. And then you you liked a bit. So I haven't read this before, but you had brought this up. So there's this guy Jefferson who starts out as he's like a paramilitary leader, right? And of like a right-wing paramilitary group, and then he gets this sort of very lenient deal where he serves very limited prison time, and then spends time sort of going back and forth between Venezuela and Colombia, and sort of sets himself up as a sort of kind of mid-level narco, right? And he's got these kind of grandiose ambitions. And this American reporter is kidnapped, and then he eventually gets his hands on her. Though he doesn't want this to have happened, because he doesn't want the American military presence, and he knows like this is going to sort of elevate him in ways that he doesn't want, and he wants to be able to sort of fly under the radar. So he's sort of thinking of what to do and what might happen, and like, are they going to send the Navy SEALs to go get him because he's got this American journalist? So he's thinking about that. Later, as he ate an early dinner, he saw he had a message from Javier asking to meet. Undoubtedly, Javier wanted to know why the journalist hadn't been released. That was what he should do, but he allowed himself to wait, allowed a fantasy to flower in his mind. Oh, and I should note he has a terminal illness, right? It's probably significant. In the fantasy, the Americans sent Navy SEALs in to get the journalist. They came to a house where they thought she was being held, but which was in fact a trap for killing gringos. In the fantasy, his men slaughter the SEALs, all except one. It's the Navy SEAL who killed Osama bin Laden. Not the clown he'd seen taking credit on television, but the real one. The one the US government doesn't want you to know about. He's a big man, very strong. He looks like Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, but white. And maybe that's his name, Rock. Steve Rock, the true killer of Osama bin Laden. And Steve Rock has biceps the size of soccer balls. Steve Rock has a dick as thick as a Coke can. On his chest, Steve Rock has a tattoo of an American flag. On his back, Steve Rock has a tattoo of Steve Rock killing Osama bin Laden. Steve Rock is large. Steve Rock is glistening. Steve Rock is like Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, and Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando, and Jean-Claude Van Damme in Black Eagle. Steve Rock's hair is long and his eyes are blue, and Steve Rock is crying. He's surrounded by the bodies of his fellow SEALs, all of them piled on the floor, their bodies riddled with bullets, and Steve Rock fires his machine gun into the air until he's out of bullets, and then Jefferson steps from the shadows, and Steve Rock throws down his weapon, and the two men square off, the younger, stronger man against the older, sicker one. But Jefferson is wise, and Jefferson is vicious, and Jefferson knocks Steve Rock down with one punch. Jefferson flings the blood of the fallen SEALs in Steve Rock's eyes and kicks them through a window. Jefferson lures Steve Rock into a tight space where his size and strength are a disadvantage, and Jefferson conquers Steve Rock. He takes him to Venezuela and parades through the streets with Steve Rock in a cage behind him, and the people throw flowers at the feet of Jefferson and rancid meat into the face of Steve Rock, and Jefferson is declared the new Uribe, the new Chavez, the new Castro, the new Che Guevara. Of course, Jefferson would still have to die. The gringos could never let him live. That's how it would have to go, and it would be best. A man like him didn't deserve to die from a disease, stumbling downward on the path of life. He deserved to die while climbing to the heavens. He deserved to die while still fully alive. He deserved to be on t-shirts.
Dude, I mean, it's so good. It's funny. It's psychologically precise. It's I don't know what to say about that. That's just like, that's got to be, you got to do that reading more. I mean, it's so good. I was talking to Phil ahead of the interview, though, that like, I mean, there's just so many great passages, and I just would encourage you all, again, to impulse buy this book if you haven't already. If you already own it, just buy another one. Buy the e-copy if you have the hard copy, and vice versa. But it's worth buying because strictly for like the ending of the book, I would just say like one of the best and like you know, it's sort of like a symphony that comes to the end, and like all the little themes that have been laid all along just come together in this incredible literary flourish that is also about the meaning of the whole book. Just the last 3 pages, you hit this note, which I think few writers could really sustain. So anyway, just praise, man. Just
Thank you.
great stuff.
Thank you.
All right, so look, I want to let's just go back to the beginning a little bit, and just say, Redeployment came out in 2014. You spent 6 years writing this. Now I know
Yeah.
you've done some great journalism, award-winning journalism, as we mentioned. But tell me about this. I mean, 6 years is, I think, for most novelists, a little bit on the long side.
Sure.
Did you feel like, were you like working that whole time on this,
Yeah.
or how did it?
Well, this was a hard book to write, right? So, and it required a lot of research. It required me, you know, my Spanish is not great now, but it required me bringing my Spanish up to a level where I could, you know, read primary sources and with the help of my wife, interview people in Colombia. Um, you know, there was just a lot of, you know, I just had to read a ton, you know, just a lot of work that had to go in before I could even start writing this book, you know. So 6 years felt about right, to be perfectly honest. And it's
But
also,
wait, but before you go on, Phil, like, so then why did you choose this topic? I mean, like, and like, did you know it would be such a big ask? Like, it would
sure,
take so long. Yeah, yeah.
sure, but it felt vital to me because it felt like getting at the heart of something very important about the way violence works in the world now, the way the American military functions in the world now, right? That there was something important about understanding, you know, 'cause understanding how America projects power around the world and violence around the world. It's just an important thing to understand as an American, right? You know, if you're an American citizen, that's a large part of what we do is our military, as a country, and yet it couldn't be, you know, I wanted to have a novel that didn't dumb anything down, but didn't feel abstract. I wanted to be a novel that gripped you, where you got caught up in stories and characters, who felt sort of rich and alive, and who were dealing with the kind of ideas that people have about how to function in this world, right? Marked as it is by violence, and what that means, you know, for people. Um, and that was always going to take a long time, right? You know, if you think about, it's not, you know, it's 400 pages, which is not a short book, but if you think about what's in there, there's a lot of stuff, right? You know, there's 4 first person narratives that sort of, you know, are almost designed like like novellas, right? For each character. Um, and then the novel switches in the final half into the third person and sort of broadens out into a larger social scene, where where all the 4 main characters, their kind of plot lines get integrated, but you also understand other perspectives, and other, you know, people involved in this situation. And so, um, that, you know, that was not the sort of thing to manage that amount of material, to make it, um, easily accessible to the reader, not just accessible to the reader, but actually compelling and interesting, and to be able to try and, you know, imagine my way into these narrators. It was always going to take a long time.
Yeah, yeah. So in the end, it felt about right. You kind of like, you knew it was going to be a big project, and it was, and 6
Yes.
years was kind of probably what you would have guessed at the outset anyway.
I don't know if I would have guessed 6 years, but, you know, redeployment took me 4.5.
Yeah.
So, you know, you know, you need to think about this stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's slow thinking. I think that
How do you?
otherwise you just kind of regurgitate what's already out there.
Oh, totally, man. And it's so well worth it. I was saying to Phil ahead of the interview that I thought I've never quite read a book like this. So on the originality front, you certainly nailed it. I'm just kind of curious. This is like a publishing nerd question. Like,
Sure.
was your agent or editor like on you and just like, come
Nope.
on, Phil, you know?
No, my agent and editor are pretty chill. You know, so I think
Because
they
people
just
were
kind of figure
waiting.
like,
People were excited, you
yeah.
know? So that's cool though. All right. So You have talked a lot so far. Just, I mean, you've covered a lot of ground already, just in the few questions that I've asked. But the one thing that I sort of want to zero in on is you're writing a book about war fiction for an American audience that doesn't really, I would say, in the history of our country, the average American citizen has to think less about the American military now than it ever had to before. I
Mhm.
mean, you would probably you'd have a better opinion, a more informed opinion than I. But it seems like most people can go through their lives. There's like no threat of a draft. It's an all volunteer force. So much of it is done through military contractors. And on top of that, so much of it is technologized. And so like
Mhm.
soldiers aren't needed in the same number as they once
Yes.
were. So there's all kinds of reasons. So, but I think like what's so interesting about this work is that the opportunity that it gives Americans to really understand what their military is doing in their own name. And you had this great piece in the New York Times. I just want to read like two quotes from it and then just give
Mhm.
you the floor back to just kind of talk about how these ideas worked into this book. The piece is called "What Defines a Modern Warrior?" So the first quote is, quote, "It seems to me that the defining feature of our modern wars is not any kind of technological change, no matter how startling the deployment of drones is or the use of social media by combatants, but rather the degree to which the average citizen of Western democracy has been able to divorce himself from responsibility for wars waged in his behalf and with his tax dollars." And then the next quote is, "This is the state of modern warfare: violence, suffering, and a sustained lack of serious moral attention." So clearly this book you've written is seeking
Sure.
to address some of these problems that you bring up in that. But I just kind of wanted to get your own reaction to those words you
Sure.
wrote 5 years ago.
Yeah. So, it's it's one of these difficult things, and in a way, you think you always imagine it was better before, but then, I was reading there's a Vietnam memoirist who was talking about how he came back from Vietnam and just assumed that everybody else would be consumed with, Vietnam, right? The dark star around which he was perpetually in orbit. And it just wasn't the case, right? And and which because, you know, people have lives and other difficulties, and there are other issues that concern people. And I think one of the problems is you mentioned that there are sort of technological changes that have meant that we're not that we don't need as many soldiers, and that we don't have a draft, and those things are true in terms of why there's not that much sustained attention. I also think it's important to note that there have been political choices that have been made, right? Um, the Obama administration, after sort of pulling troops out of Iraq with a lot of fanfare because that was part of his sort of mandate, right? Um, they, after the rise of ISIS, began reintroducing combat troops, right? While they were cutting other types of um, like economic assistance, right? Normally, if you are pulling out military aid, you would want increased economic assistance or other sort of soft tools, soft power type kind of things. But they cut non-military aid, but then after the rise of ISIS, began ramping up military aid. Now, on the one level, it kind of makes sense. ISIS was pretty horrific, right? Um, but they didn't want to take responsibility for it, so they would sort of argue that these were just advisors, that they might end up in combat situations, but they weren't in combat, that they weren't boots on the ground, um, and just rapidly got ridiculous. I remember being at an event in, I think, 2015. The counter ISIS fight is well underway, and Susan Rice introduced us, and there were active duty military in this audience. There were several severely injured troops, guys missing limbs, right? Guys whose faces were severely burned. Um, uh, Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was there. Um, and she said, in the Obama administration, one of our proudest accomplishments is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And somebody in the audience went, right? Um, and and Obama said the same thing at a fundraiser, 2 months later, right? This was a talking point in the administration. They didn't want to take the political hit for it, um, but they were not willing to disengage. So what we got was a sort of policy with a very heavy reliance on things that caused very little political cost: use of special operators, use of drones and airstrikes, um, and and of course, sort of perpetual use of mercenaries um, overseas. So, and also very little transparency about what was actually happening. That has essentially continued into the Trump administration in terms of military policy and the ways that we function now. There's not actually that great a difference, right? If you look at the counter ISIS fight as waged under Obama versus Trump, the only difference is that Trump, changed the rules of engagement to allow more civilian casualties or greater tolerance for civilian casualties, right? But it's not like the Obama administration wasn't killing a lot of civilians.
Yeah.
So, and under Trump, the Department of Defense has become even less transparent than before. So that, and then when there are sort of questions about whether our policy is being effective, instead of pointing to kind of benchmarks for political stability or us achieving geopolitical ends, our politicians tend to brag about people they killed. So about Obama in his last State of the Union address bragged about killing Osama bin Laden, getting the head of the guy who planned the Benghazi attack. Trump has been bragging about Qasem Soleimani, right? So I think that, and then on top of that, our Congress has not voted on an authorization of military force. We're using a decade, almost 2-decade-old authorization for the use of military force at this point, using it to fight groups that did not exist when it was voted on. And my personal feelings that if we're going to be killing people abroad every 2 years, the president should have to go before Congress. He should have to say where we're killing people, why we're doing it, what we hope to achieve, what the benchmarks of success might be, so that 2 years from now, like, we can ask if they've been achieved, how much it'll cost, right? And then every member of Congress should vote on it. Right? But Congress doesn't want to do that. When America was founded, the founders didn't even want a standing army, right? They wanted to force a regular vote to even maintain a standing army. These days, we don't even have a regular vote to maintain a standing war.
Yeah, and I've heard you bring up some really great points about the kind of lack of coherence around a lot of American military activity. And just like,
Sure.
For example, you were talking somewhere else about the Obama administration and how there's this great increase in use of drone strikes and so on. And like, some of the individual targets indeed can seem gratifying or satisfying because it's like, this is a really evil man, good thing he's gone. But it's like, these are just like little dots on a vast map, and like the picture that it ultimately paints is not necessarily coherent. And I want to hear you respond to that, but there was this one other remark you made along these lines in another interview. Somebody asked you kind of like, what is the kind of coherent U.S. foreign policy as enacted through its military? Are we an empire or are we not? And you sort of said America sort of has one foot in both places. Yeah. I think the quote is, we are an empire that can't admit it's an empire, and therefore the incoherence sometimes of our military activity. So your thoughts?
Yeah, we have an aggressive presence all over the world, sometimes surprising to our own elected leaders, right? I mean, you remember when troops killed in Niger, and I forget which, I think it was a senator was like, I didn't even know we had troops there, which is kind of astounding that he would feel comfortable making that admission, right? But then we don't really expect Congress to be maintaining that much oversight anymore, right?
Yeah.
So why would he? Why would he know? And this is, and it goes back, I think, to one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book that I did, because there's the kind of moral attention of the American public, right, is one thing. But we also need institutions, robust institutions that can advocate for better policy or force decision makers to make harder decisions. We need uh, sort of better norms and structural checks. And I think that we have in this kind of current age, and it should be admitted that like the one of the reasons that we're in this place is not just because of sort of malign and cowardly political decisions and bad actors. It's also because the security environment is weird and diffuse, where you have sort of this blurring between war and terrorism and crime, right? Where there's a reason that one of the Jefferson, who you heard about his fantasizing, he starts out as a right-wing paramilitary, right? And then smoothly transitions into being a narco, right? And there are these kind of legal distinctions that we're trying to make to determine, like, should we be dealing with this guy in terms of law enforcement, as like a military threat? Should we be thinking less about him than about the sort of the whether or not the government actually has legitimacy in the place where he has power? Because one of the things about a lot of these places where we're engaged in violence is that you don't have much presence of the actual state, of the sort of state that the theoretically that territory is within the borders of, and the groups that are acting in terms of day-to-day in people's lives as the authority, as the actual sort of functional government, might be non-state actors, right? Might be communist guerrillas, might be right-wing paramilitaries, might be a drug boss, right? And so one of the characters in the book, Abel, he ends up after this, he has a somewhat tragic beginning, but he ends up in this right-wing paramilitary group, and he ends up essentially doing civil affairs for the paramilitaries and like working out how to bring in like New Zealand milking experts to help production in the region, which by the way actually happened, right? Paramilitary groups like bringing in New Zealand tech and experts, and all these weird things, that because those groups want the people to like them, because
Yeah.
it improves their standing and their ability to control the areas that are valuable to them.
The shadow
And
government.
right, and Avel lives in a region that, like, in terms of legitimate industry, is really, it's not the kind of place that's ever going to be in the near term any particularly interesting to elites in Bogota. But for people interested in the drug trade, right, for non-state actors, it's always going to be very interesting and very valuable territory, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, the Colombian government can come in and kill somebody when they find out about his giant teddy bear orders for his girlfriend.
Yeah.
But will they be able to stay and provide services to people, and sort of legitimate power structure that the local people are going to trust and assume will be there when things go bad?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. All right. So look, I just want to, like, in the last portion of this interview, I want to like pivot a little bit. It's funny. I heard you in another interview, you were asked, do you feel sometimes, the effect of the question was, do you feel pigeonholed sometimes as a war writer, and you can kind of only get talked, not only do you only talk about war fiction, but more, you just end up getting asked questions about like politics and the military, and like it's got nothing to do with like the literary aspects of your work, which I think are substantial. And so I just want to like pivot a little bit there, and just talk about your literary influences and some of your kind of like non-war fiction sort of influences. And it was no mistake that I compared it to Dostoevsky meets The Wire, because I know you have said that Dostoevsky is sort of a lodestar for you, and somebody that
Yes.
he's a great influence on you. And I know that, just in case anybody doesn't know, Phil has a podcast called Manifesto, and I'll let you explain what that is if you'd like. But in short, he, in this podcast, you will see the side of Phil, which is like sort of buried beneath the surface here, which is like an extremely intellectually rigorous individual. And I'm not saying like that's a surprise or something, but I'm just saying you artfully, NPR called it a book of ideas, but kind of like the great intellectual rigor and philosophical rigor in this book is masked in just great prose and great character. So it's not just sort of all about that. And like, I think in your manifesto podcast, you get to be purely kind of operate on that intellectual and philosophical and spiritual front. So it's a fascinating podcast. But anyway, let's just go back to Dostoevsky and some of the kind of religious and theological ideas. I mean, like, look, Redeployment had 12 stories in it. This book, there's a character named Abel, I don't know how to quite pronounce it, but Abel, you know, it's a biblical name, of course. You know, the book is called Missionaries. I mean, clearly there's some big religious kind of grappling going on within you. You end the book on a note, on a religious note. So I just sort of like, there isn't really a specific question here other than maybe Dostoevsky is the entry point, but I just kind of wanted to like have you talk about some of these underpinnings for the book that are philosophical and religious.
You know, maybe, can I just read 2 paragraphs?
Yeah.
Definitely. So it's very important to me because it's, you know, it's not just about understanding the kind of geopolitics, but like the extremity of violence brings out, so forces people into kind of collision of the values or the ways that they saw the world, right? And the things that they believe about it, right? And it sort of puts those under pressure. And there's a scene where Mason, who's a medic in special forces, so really he's extremely skilled, right, at treating wounds, and he's in this giant battle in that actually happened in Afghanistan, and his buddy is blown up, and he kind of treats him as like packing his inner organs, right, to try and save his life. And then later, after the battle, he's reflecting. There are 2 ways to think about severe wounds. One is the very smallness and weakness of the human body, pathetic even compared with other animals, and so easy to break beyond repair. So easy even with the most basic of tools. A rock is enough. And then to think of it in the midst of the sorts of things that happen in war. Not just explosions sending earth and brick blossoming, but weapons that work by strange inversions of pressure, collapse buildings from the inside, or concentrate force in small spaces that liquefy metal and send it shooting out through the air. The penetration of the human body is so easy, it almost seems beside the point. Such tools should be used for greater creatures enough. We are weak, we are fragile, and so perhaps we are nothing. There's wonder in the world, the unbearable blackness of the sky in Afghanistan, its piercing stars, the vibrations of the gun's soundless light on the horizon, flashes like echoes, a moon rising over sharp blades of mountain while tracers carve lines into the night. But man himself is nothing. But the other way of thinking is the opposite. That the world itself is what is small. Mountains, stars, horizon, so much accumulation of rocks, dust, and an expanse of empty air. Meaningless without someone there to see it. I was once shot in the shoulder. The world around me wobbled and vibrated and collapsed to nothing in the midst of the pain. I applied my mind to the pain, oriented myself, returned the world to its proper place around me. I thought of my brothers who I was currently failing by no longer being in the fight, by being injured, perhaps badly enough that I would need their help leaving this place under fire when they had enough to carry without me. I thought of my wife and daughter, and then I looked at my arm, flopped to the side, immobile, mere matter, a thing, meaningless. And I applied my mind again to the pain, and a finger wiggled, dead flesh suddenly live. There was a miracle there in the difference between the 2. So, yeah, the characters are not just experiencing this war. They're also trying to figure out what it's telling them about the world that they live in and about what it means to be a human being. And all of them have very different ideas. You know, one of the things that I admire about Dostoevsky is, you know, when you read his novels, it's not like there's a a guy who represents Dostoevsky, who's going around like kicking everybody else's ass in argument, right? Like in an Ayn Rand book, right? Where like there's like the obviously good characters and then the obviously bad characters. You know, the most eloquent person in the Brothers Karamazov is Ivan Karamazov, right? So eloquent, he has been inspiring to atheists for generations, even though Dostoevsky was a fervent believer, right? And later, Dostoevsky bragged, you know, the adults have ridiculed my obscurantism. They never could have conceived of an attack on religion as powerful as I wrote. And it's true, right? Like, it's just, you know, the Rebellion and Grand Inquisitor chapters are sort of classic works of, you know, attacks on theodicy. Lev Shestov thought that Ivan won the argument. Camus was inspired by it. You know, the rebel, you see Ivan Karamazov all over that, sometimes explicitly. And so that's what you can do in fiction, is have characters who weren't just pontificating to pontificate, but because they've just had really intense experiences that they have to think through. They don't have a choice but to try and understand. You know, it's easy enough if you live, you know, you live relatively comfortably and you got Netflix and you got Twitter and you got the jokes about Jeffrey Toobin, like, to not think about those things. You can constantly distract yourself, right? But when things go really bad, or when you're exposed to just the extremity of human experience and the variety of it, right, and the variety of ways that people respond, you find that you have to sort of look down pretty deeply inside yourself to come up with a response to it. And so that is as important to me in the crafting of the book. And actually, for all the, you know, as the geopolitics, and for all that I talked about geopolitics and, you know, trying to improve my Spanish so I could do Spanish interviews, that was also a major part of why it took 6 years to write.
Mm-hmm. Just because you were kind of coming to terms with some of these deeper spiritual ideas?
And trying to figure out what these characters might think about them, right? And what paths they might, you know, go. You know, I mean, all of the characters, they believe in something, not necessarily God, right? But they have beliefs, and so there's their kind of idealism and their beliefs about the world, and then there's a kind of reality that it gets, you know, tossed up against, and then there's their career, sort of in the middle of that, and what's that is propelling them to do, and then the justifications that they're going to come up with in response to it.
Last question on this before we move on, but you described Dostoevsky as a fervent believer. Obviously, he's got an incredible personal story of all that he went through and the ways that his faith was tested in his own life. Do you feel like you have a certain point of view that maybe is disguised, and you clearly enjoy exploring other people's points of view, but is there something that you are trying to kind of personally put out into the world through this that somehow could be summarized?
Well, I've got my own ideas, obviously, but the thing about writing a novel versus other types of, you know, I write nonfiction, and with nonfiction, you know, yeah, you know, I wrote a long piece for the Atlantic about why I think our foreign policy, military policy is jacked up, right? That's what that's about. That's what you're supposed to know when you read the whole thing, right? With a novel, it's very different because the reading itself is a creative act, right? The Romantic poet Jean-Paul described books as thick letters to friends. That's the way that I like to think of it. This is a letter to a friend. It's not designed to just impose my view on a friend. That's not why you write a friend, right? It's supposed to share something, open its arms to invite them into an experience that they might not have thought about or considered before. And then once they've done that, to respond, you know, and that's what the best books do to me. You know, I read Dostoevsky, I read, you know, Conrad, I read Ralph Ellison, I read, you know, these books behind me, right? You know, Cleanness by Garth Greenwell. And I feel like it calls something out of me and exposes me to new ways of thinking about reality and understanding the world and existing as a person inside of it. And that makes me want to respond, maybe not directly to the author themselves, right? They might be long dead, but to sort of continue that conversation in some way.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. Well, look, I want to move into the last question here, and that's kind of a good segue. This is a question that I like to ask every author that comes on the show, which is this. Imagine that you have the ideal reader for your book, and like everything that you're doing, they're understanding, every reference you make, they're getting, everywhere you go, they follow. Imagine that that person has now closed the book, just finished it. How would you describe the feeling that you leave them with after getting through this book, if it can be summarized?
I don't know. Something has to change, maybe.
Mm.
And that change is possible.
All right, we'll just leave that there. We'll just leave that there. And that is definitely a feeling that I had at the end of the book as well, among, I think, awe at how beautiful the book was and how well constructed it was a companion feeling that I also had. So anyway, Phil Klay, thank you so much. This has been amazing. Could you just grab the book and just hold it up in front of people one last time just so they see it? There it is, folks. Destined for Greatness, destined to be on your shelf in a week when you order it right now. Phil Klay, National Book Award winner. The book is called Missionaries. Thank you so much for being on The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, folks, next week we'll be back on with Pete Beattie to discuss his American fantasy fable romp, as I mentioned, Cuyahoga, and the search for the soul of America on The Thoughtful Bro continues. We'll see you all then.